The G-58 was originally designed to specialize in the transport of hazardous radioactive materials. Usually, this sort of dangerous job would be relegated to droids, but the G-58's robust radiation control system was deemed effective enough to keep organic occupants within safe levels of exposure. The two large fins act as radiators for the ship's cargo hold and carry radiation harmlessly away from the ship. Considering it was a vessel found on the civilian market, the G-58 had unusually strong armor and shields, as every precautionary measure had been taken to ensure that nothing could penetrate the transport's cargo hold and potentially scatter dangerous material across an entire star system. These safety measures made the G-58 ideal for wartime conversion, as it required relatively few modifications to engage military-grade vessels. This particular G-58, named the Queen Mola, was donated to the war effort by a small business owner who was put out of a job when he refused to join the Imperial-backed mining guild. It was soon retrofitted with heavy laser cannons and anti-fighter quad laser turrets, and half of its cargo bay was converted into a space-efficient hangar system, holding a total of 6 A-Wing interceptors. The remaining half of the cargo bay was largely converted into the service space and fuel storage necessary to field half a squadron of fighters. Consequently, the Queen Mola typically operated as support for fleets with otherwise sparse fighter support, such as this one, which consisted of largely undefended GR-75 transports, as well as vulnerable tanker ships and utility vessels. With a robust communication and sensor array and relatively heavy armament for a ship of its size, the Incursor class was ideal for controlling fringe border worlds where the continued presence of a proper Star Destroyer would be deemed unnecessary or otherwise costly. Carrying a full squadron of TIE fighters and several landing craft, the Incursor class was fully capable of single-handedly sustaining the occupation of a small system. In my mind, the Nebulon was ordered by the Empire as few as 5 years after the conclusion of the Clone Wars as an alternative to the Architens class, whose deficiencies in armament and fightercraft were highlighted by the fact that it often needed to enter combat as part of a battle group, relying on Gozanti-class cruisers to provide most of its fighter support. The Nebulon project would improve on and combine the best elements of both ships. It was more streamlined and more heavily armed than an Architens, and could hold 3 times as many starfighters as a Gozanti, which without its fighter complement was virtually useless in a fight. The Nebulon, with a full squadron of starfighters and relatively heavy armament, could in theory go toe-to-toe with a much larger vessel. But the Nebulon's development was plagued by upsets. As first realized, the Nebulon lacked most of the forward blade section and housed much of its personnel forward of the hangar bay. This arrangement proved less than ideal, as the hangar facilities were considered much too small, mostly being dedicated to tightly packed TIE fighters and affording no space to shuttles, bombers, or any visiting craft. To make matters worse, the single dorsal aperture made simultaneous launch and retrieval a logistical nightmare. Tragically, Kuat engineers discovered one final flaw too late. In the alpha prototype of the Nebulon, vertical concussion missile launch systems were positioned between the crew facilities and the forward end of the hangar bay. During an ill-fated high-speed TIE retrieval drill, an explosion on the flight deck chain reacted to the launch systems, blasting the ship apart at a critical weak point. Needless to say, the Nebulon-A was scrapped within a year, and a new model was drafted, the Nebulon-B, which reinforced the weak point and enlarged the forward blade section. This allowed crew facilities to be moved from the midsection and freed up space for an expanded hangar system. Now, a squadron of TIEs could be stored relatively comfortably and out of the way, with space to spare for additional craft. This expanded hangar system was incredibly lavish for a ship as relatively small as the Nebulon-B, and it was equally complex, representing the most sophisticated TIE storage and launching mechanisms in the fleet. In just 2,500 square meters, the Nebulon-B could service 12 standard TIE fighters and as many as 6 twin-hulled TIE variants, such as the TIE Bomber and the TIE Shuttle, and still had 700 meters to spare for an open hangar. This facility was specifically designed to accommodate ships as large as the Lambda Shuttle, which, while stylish and elegantly imposing, were notoriously difficult to dock inside smaller frigates and light cruisers. And even though the Nebulon-B could accommodate a Lambda Shuttle, Any sufficiently large craft landed in the hangar would need to be launched again in short order to keep flight lines clear, but long-term docking facilities were available on the underside of the ship for these sorts of circumstances. But for all the fighters and firepower that Kuat engineers could pack into the Nebulon, the project was doomed from the beginning. The Nebulon was ordered in a time when complete Imperial rule was more of a dream and less of a certified reality. In practice, the Empire was quite popular on some worlds, and it was militarily overpowering on the rest, meaning that the regime had virtually no difficulty enforcing its rule, and complete ownership of a galaxy of resources and personnel meant that the Imperial Star Destroyer, once envisioned as the ultimate pinnacle of the Starfleet, was rapidly becoming the standard ship of the line. By the time that the Nebulon was entering service, the demand for smaller, more versatile ships was simply not great enough to justify such an expensive and complicated vessel as the Nebulon-B. Ultimately, the Empire would continue to use battle groups of Clone Wars-era Architens and Gozantes for close to 15 years, but almost all of these aging ships were deployed in relatively sparsely populated systems. Many of the completed Nebulon-B units never entered service and remained in storage at Kuat facilities for years. Several years before the Battle of Yavin, a cell of the fledgling Rebel Alliance undertook a mission to capture an orbital boneyard containing several uncommissioned Nebulon-B frigates. While intel suggested that these ships were completely spaceworthy, the reality was that these ships had been completely picked over. The nearby shipyard had been scavenging them for components for years, repurposing many, if not most, of their supplemental systems for the production of Star Destroyers. What the Rebels found were mere skeletons, and many were completely non-functional. Still, the Rebels took the opportunity and managed to abscond with an unspecified number of the vessels. The Rebels would go on to trade these around to different cells to do with as they pleased. Some were completely dismantled, and their parts were used to modify existing ships or to build planet-side structures, and other cells would undertake huge projects to return some of these Nebulons to a functional status. Unfortunately, even the most salvageable Nebulon-B frigates were hardly comparable to the formidable Imperial warships that they had been in their past lives. Consequently, some of these restored Nebulon-Bs were repurposed for other roles, such as hospital or logistical vessels. But even so, the Nebulon-B appeared, much to the Empire's surprise, at several major engagements, solidifying the Nebulon-B as a symbol of the rebellion. What we have here started its life as a 650-meter Uru-class luxury liner known as the Sphaerolana, which was known as an incredibly popular and decidedly lavish recreational cruiser before the Clone Wars. But wartime and the eventual rise of the Empire left it out of service for many years. As the Mon Calamari began retrofitting civilian vessels for war against the Empire, even cruise ships like the Sphaerolana were seen as strong contenders for conversion into warships, as these vessels typically had high-quality hyperdrives and decent shielding pre-installed. Owing to their often extensive and spacious passenger accommodations, luxury liners were often converted into mobile hospitals and logistical support vessels, but some were given extra armor and weapons for frontline combat, as would be the fate of the Sphaerolana. As a luxury liner, the Sphaerolana carried nominal defensive weapons, basically a small array of light concealable laser cannons to ward off pirates, but to make her suitable for military service, a number of passenger facilities were removed and replaced with modular weapon emplacements and additional power generators. Where there were once opulent transparasteel viewports in the floor, wartime retrofitters added an array of turbo lasers. In this case, these dual turbo laser turrets were salvaged from an otherwise inoperable CR-90 corvette. Altogether, the Sphaerolana was outfitted with 15 turbolasers and 26 anti-starfighter laser turrets. As originally built, the Sphaerolana already had relatively high-performance engines. Even so, they were deemed unsuitable for contending with the proper warships of the Imperial Starfleet. The solution was to simply attach additional thrusters, powered by a supplementary reactor which took up a large portion of the cargo hold. As is characteristic for Mon Calamari design, the skeletal frame of the Sphaerolana was robust and quite well suited for supporting additional mass. But the original hull structure, while technically strong enough to support the mass of additional thrusters, was not necessarily capable of withstanding the engines under full power, meaning that the crew risked collateral damage to the ship every time they took it to its maximum sublight velocity. Although difficult to maintain and modified far beyond safety margins, the Sphaerolana proved vital to the Mon Calamari Starfleet, which was otherwise lacking in smaller, faster frigate-sized ships that could quickly enter deep into a battle zone and launch starfighters under the cover of relatively heavy turbolaser fire. To this end, the Sphaerolana was retrofitted with a hangar facility much larger than most ships of its size, thanks to the fact that as a luxury liner, the Sphaerolana once housed a lavish interior water feature, complete with artificial beaches, reefs, and non-sentient aquatic life. This entire feature and all its related systems were completely removed and replaced with modular hangar facilities. Complete with repair and fabrication bays, this hangar could hold and service an entire squadron of starfighters, though the size of the ventral hangar aperture couldn't accommodate anything much larger than an X-wing. Altogether, the Sphaerolana proved to be a highly effective improvised warship, but was obviously overshadowed by the larger and more visible Mon Calamari cruisers. But while the Sphaerolana could not go toe-to-toe with a Star Destroyer, its heavy weapons and large starfighter complement did outclass virtually every starship in its category. I imagine that the YX-950 was a relatively common vessel prior to the Clone Wars, but after the collapse of the Republic, they were all but banned by the new Galactic Empire under the cover story that the power plant of the YX-950 was unstable and a potential safety hazard to its occupants as well as any shipyard facility it found itself docked at. In reality, the opposite was true. The YX-950 was only a threat to the Empire because its reactor system was so reliable. Like other Corellian freighter designs, the YX-950 had a relatively massive decentralized reactor that could power oversized engines and give it incredible durability for a ship of its size. In the case of the YX-950, it could also power a number of onboard facilities such as refineries for fuel and raw materials, as well as fabrication bays. This power output could easily be converted to support capital-scale weapons, and was, as previously mentioned, spread out across the ship, making it very difficult to destroy the entire power system simultaneously, which would make this otherwise humble ship capable of going toe-to-toe with Imperial frigates. As the YX-950 became increasingly rare in Imperial space, seasoned captains took their ships and their businesses as far from the Empire as they could, though the demand for industrial freighters wasn't as high in low-population fringe regions, and a number of these vessels would wind up in the growing Rebel Alliance. The Kyprin Renegade was one such vessel. The ship's namesake comes from the Kyprin fish, a symbol of freedom and tenacity in Corellian folklore, and a patriotic symbol for some Corellian freedom fighters. The Kyprin Renegade bore this symbol on the underside of its hull. Now, the Kyprin Renegade was never converted into a warship, but instead made use of its existing onboard fabrication and mechanical bays. The Rebellion was generally lacking in permanent bases, and even the few it had weren't ideal for overhauling crippled fighters or building new ones, as these facilities were generally much harder to mobilize at a moment's notice. Though the maintenance facilities aboard the Kyprin Renegade were never intended to be used on starfighters, resulting in cramped conditions. To increase the number of fighters it could service, the Renegade carried lifter vehicles with specialized attachments for different Rebel fighters. Altogether, the Renegade could service 2 X-Wings or 2 Y-Wings at once, or easily 6 A-Wings. Now, the Kyprin Renegade by far wasn't the only maintenance ship in the Rebel fleet, but it was certainly known as the most efficient and easily produced the best results. This was partially thanks to its famous team of cutting-edge BA-series astromechs. These repair droids had improved intelligence over R-series astromechs, and their omnidirectional spherical locomotion system allowed them to work at an unprecedented speed. The apparent leader of this team was BA-77, a droid known by virtually every Rebel fleet technician for its uncanny ability to problem solve. The droid was so intelligent that it was often known to come up with solutions faster than organic life forms could even comprehend the original problem. Needless to say, only the technicians with the highest levels of self-confidence worked aboard the Renegade. Now, I'm sure you've all noticed what appears to be a YT-style freighter embedded in the hull of this ship. This is in fact a YSB utility transport, which comes pre-installed with the the YX-950, though notably not with the cheaper and less popular YX-900. While the YX-950 is capable of landing, most spaceports either couldn't accommodate a ship of its size or would charge prohibitive fees to discourage landing such a ship. That's where the utility transport comes in. In general, it ostensibly has most of the features of a YT-style ship, but is designed with short ferry flights in mind rather than long-distance freight pushing like the YT-1300. Some might say that this makes the YSB a cheap imitation of a YT-style ship, but the YSB was never designed to function independently. As such, it has a less robust hyperdrive and lower power engines when compared with a YT-style freighter, but it's more than enough to carry personnel, equipment, and light cargo between the mothership and a planet's surface. And even so, they're not unpopular ships in their own right, and can easily be modified into a more capable and independent ship. As mentioned before, the fleet here had 3 YX-950 ships, and it would be a disservice to ignore the other 2 ships, which have stories and heroic crews of their own. Here is the Kypern Renegade. The second is the Brute, which is immediately recognizable due to its missing mandible and command module. These were removed to give a clear line of fire for its aftermarket triple turbo laser, which it could easily conceal or deploy at a moment's notice. This hidden capital-grade weapon gave the Brute a terrifying edge when ambushing Imperial patrols, and could even deal serious damage to a Star Destroyer if it was lucky enough to catch one with its shields down. The final YX-950 in this fleet was known as the Glory Glider, a dedicated cargo transport and logistical command center, managing all the vital supply lines that kept the fleet operating. While not a combat vessel, the Glory Glider was one of the most risky assignments in the fleet. Its operations around the galaxy drew the attention of pirates and the Empire alike, yet it maintained only light armament and shielding so as to give the crew as much plausible deniability about their cargo as possible. It's much easier to come up with a cover story for why you're carrying weapons-grade materials if your own ship itself doesn't look like it's prepared for war. This is the TIE Vigilant, which is most easily described as a TIE fighter designed for long-range, unsupported escort missions. As such, they have a few notable modifications as well as a number of subtle differences from standard TIE fighters. Most obviously, the TIE Vigilant was equipped with a hyperdrive unit, allowing it to keep up with virtually any ship in the Imperial fleet, though the TIE Vigilant would be seen most often flanking the Lambda-class shuttles of high-ranking Imperial officers. The TIE Vigilant was also equipped with basic deflector shielding. Given its extra power needs beyond that of a standard TIE fighter, the TIE Vigilant had thicker, more robust solar collector panels with some 10% more surface area. The extra mass theoretically made the TIE Vigilant somewhat less maneuverable than a standard TIE fighter, but its highly increased durability more than made up for this slight deficiency. In addition, the TIE Vigilant was equipped with increased firepower, such as a center-aligned ion cannon, accompanying twin laser cannons of a higher output than those found on standard TIE fighters. The TIE Vigilant was also operated by the Emperor's Royal Guard. While some expected the Emperor's Royal Guard to fly ships that were as flamboyantly colored as their uniforms, in reality, the unassuming fighters of the Royal Guard could be identified only by the dark stripe down their center, a trait shared with the personal shuttle of their Emperor. At the controls of these fighters were the best pilots in the Empire. Elite members of the Emperor's Royal Guard, outfitted in their rarely seen flight suits, piloted these fighters with deadly skill from specialized cockpits with state-of-the-art control interfaces. These ominously dark yet regal cockpits were roomy and comfortable, perfectly suitable for long interstellar missions. Such an opulent cockpit would be the envy of Imperial pilots across the galaxy if only they had the chance to see inside. Ultimately, several Royal Guard TIE Vigilants would accompany the Emperor on his fateful visit to the Death Star II, but would forgo standard landing procedures for unknown reasons, instead patrolling alongside a parade of fighters assembled for the Emperor's inspection. These fighters would later participate in the Battle of Endor to devastating effect against Rebel B-Wing fighters. I have been calling this the CR-110, the bigger, beefier cousin of the CR-90, and I imagine that all three of the canonical Corvette designs were contemporaries of one another, offered side by side rather than as sequential models. But the CR-90, being a perfectly well-rounded ship, vastly outsold both the smaller CR-70 and the larger CR-110 models. The massive engines of the CR-110 would normally seem like a selling point for the vessel, but the overly aft-heavy center of mass actually made the CR-110 pretty difficult to maneuver, thus largely negating their appeal. That is, unless you intended to exclusively fly in perfectly straight lines. This particular CR-110 was called the Tantara, an aggressively modified corvette outfitted with extra armor, overcharged turbo lasers, and a pair of Atgar amplifying dishes, capable of generating devastating energy beams. These weapons complemented the head-on charges for which the CR-110 was uniquely qualified, making for absurdly effective ambushes on larger targets. The Tantara was also modified to carry a squadron of A-Wings, known as Breaker Squadron. Normally, a corvette of this size would carry 1 or 2 fighters maximum as rapid deployment escorts, but the Tantara could hold an entire squadron because its ventral cargo complex was completely gutted and replaced with a space-efficient flight deck. As the CR-110 wasn't equipped with an opening suitable for use as a hangar aperture, doors were built into the gaps originally left for modular cargo containers. As an A-Wing clamped onto these doors, they could swing downward, allowing the fighter to launch. Retrieval was difficult via these relatively tiny doors with razor-thin margins of error, and only extremely skilled pilots could reliably pull these maneuvers off, particularly under high-stress scenarios. The regular undertaking of these maneuvers made the pilots of Breaker Squadron well known for their technical skill, a fact which they did not hesitate to hold over fellow Alliance pilots, all in the name of healthy competition, of course. But the pilots of the Tantara are only part of the story, as equally important to the launching, retrieval, and maintenance of Breaker Squadron was the flight crew, who had to work in cramped and unforgiving conditions, trucking the A-Wings into position with specialized vehicles and a custom-designed, low-profile overhead crane system. The rear maintenance bay was claustrophobic and left very little room to operate, and it was a hot, dangerous environment to work in. All the hectic action on the hangar deck was managed from a semicircular flight control room, typically manned by 3 operators. From here, highly trained controllers had to coordinate the preparation, loading, launching, and retrieval of every fighter. The immense stress of these procedures took a daily toll on operators and flight crew, who could take a break in a small lounge area in the corner of the facility. The Tantara operated in a small battle group consisting of a Nebulon-B, a Mon Calamari corvette, 2 Gallofree gunships, and a Mon Calamari Uru-class frigate. This battle group, typically operating out of a small base on Pantora, eventually joined the rebel forces massing on and around Sullust before the Battle of Endor. Here, the Tantara received a final tune-up before joining the fleet in orbit, where it was one of at least 2 CR-110 class corvettes to participate in the battle. So this is a ship that I'm calling the Longfin, an FD-79 class corvette, which was in service of the Rebel Alliance around the time of the Battle of Hoth. This ship was 165 meters long and was equipped with 4 anti-starfighter laser turrets, multiple forward-facing laser cannons, torpedo tubes, and prominently 2 twin-barreled turbo lasers. Between ample weaponry, a specially designed armor system, and powerful engines to run down or evade enemies, the Longfin was already an effective combat vessel. But that doesn't even touch on the fact that the Longfin had ventral docking facilities, where it held a dedicated auxiliary craft, a Quarren gunship, a maneuverable and highly armed ship usually used for regional defense in areas lacking the manpower to operate starfighter squadrons. Powerful enough to take on large targets, but nimble enough to engage starfighters, the Quarren gunship was a formidable vessel. This particular ship was outfitted with rapid-fire ion bolt launchers, which could fill an entire engagement zone with hundreds of tiny, almost unavoidable needles of ionized particles. The aftermath of such a barrage could easily disable multiple attacking starfighters simultaneously, for at least long enough to allow the Longfin and the gunship to escape into hyperspace. The Longfin also had a sizable interior hangar facility, that is, relatively for a ship of its size. This hangar facility, accessed via the ventral docking pen, was technically large enough to house small starfighters, but typically found use as a maintenance garage for heavy equipment and planetside expeditionary vehicles, like land speeders and air speeders. Facilitating this role were various consoles for vehicle calibration and diagnostic tests. The use of this space as a cargo bay was also quite common, making these facilities highly versatile. Much of the Longfin's internal volume was filled with gear destined for Echo Base on Hoth. Among this gear was a T-47 in its final stages of conversion to Alliance military specs, as well as a handful of anti-armor cannon sleds. But this gear was never delivered. The Longfin, having been delayed on its last mission, was actually on its way to Hoth when the Empire began to blockade the planet. From there, the Longfin coordinated with Echo Base to provide an opening for fleeing starships. Thus, the Longfin played a key role in the evacuation of Echo Base and ensured the survival of several key starships. So why not apply hyperdrive ring technology to Imperial hardware? In the absence of a canon design for such a theoretical concept, I decided to design my own. See, the Empire could easily have things both ways, producing cheap, expendable TIE fighters with no hyperspeed capabilities, but also making a smaller number of hyperdrive units that can be attached on a mission-by-mission basis, used only when needed. Now, these hyperdrive modules would be notably less robust than their Republic predecessors. While hyperdrives are usually an expensive and maintenance-heavy technology, these modules would be more crudely assembled and designed with really only a one-way trip in mind, similar to the disposable hyperspace pods of Imperial probe droids. Exiting hyperspace, the burned-out module could be easily jettisoned and left to drift as inert space junk. While this approach would appear wasteful, the costs of maintaining the tight tolerances of a well-functioning hyperdrive unit were just about as high as the cost to factory produce a new one, and the Empire, with near unlimited resources, really had no concerns about waste. Additionally, these disposable modules would have the twofold benefit of allowing the Empire to keep a tight leash on their pilots, who were completely dependent on the Empire to come and pick them up after the completion of their mission, and this also ensured that functional hyperdrive units never fell into the hands of rebel cells or other private groups. Though these modules were actually manufactured by Arakan Industries, the same company behind the probe droid and their hyperspace pods, they were developed in close cooperation with Sinar to ensure that the hardware was completely compatible with the TIE Fighter and could be easily controlled by the TIE Fighter's computer systems. The function of these modules was quite simple. The module would open to receive the cockpit ball of a TIE Fighter and mechanically clamp down onto the ball, sharing power and computer control through two specialized clamps that interfaced with ports on the TIE Fighter. After a successful jump, the module could be jettisoned with the aid of explosive bolts. At first, Imperial engineers were concerned that the explosive jettisoning of these modules would draw attention to TIE fighter squadrons dropping out of hyperspace and thus give hostiles advance warning of their approach, but it was determined that the scattering module fragments actually had the tendency to confuse most targeting scopes, making it difficult for an enemy to understand the strength and approach vectors of the attacking force at a glance. Ultimately, as fate would have it, these modules would rarely see use. The Empire had a presence nearly everywhere in the galaxy, and there were already very few instances where Imperial facilities or Star Destroyers with their own squadrons of TIE fighters weren't already nearby, thus making hyperdrive-capable fighters largely irrelevant for the Empire. The B-Wing Mark II found its place for a brief moment in time as the New Republic transitioned to their unique model of space combat. Essentially, the vast disarmament campaign following the fall of the Empire meant that the New Republic was broadly phasing out the sort of massive capital ships that had typified the last conflict. Additionally, the New Republic was distancing itself from large-scale fighter tactics as well. Under the old model, thousands of fighters required constant, high-precision maintenance from tens of thousands of ground-based personnel in order to function with the guarantee of top combat effectiveness. Furthermore, without the limitless industrial might of the Empire, there was simply no galactic power that posed a significant threat demanding large squadrons of fighter craft. So as the New Republic backed away from both fighters and from large-scale capital ships, that left this interesting gap in the New Republic fleet, one that would be filled with patrol bombers like the PBN Y-Wing and gunships like the B-Wing Mark II. Now, there was significant overlap between the two vessels, but the PBN Y-Wing would go on to fill more peacetime roles like search and rescue as well as personnel and light cargo transport, while the B-Wing Mark II was almost always employed as a long-range combat patrol ship, and it was seen as a serious threat to both fighters blasters, and small capital ships. While officially designated as a successor to the B-Wing starfighter, this vessel shed virtually any pretense of being a fighter. It completely redefined the role of a B-Wing and was consequently often referred to as a B-Wing gunship due to its wingtip turbolaser, an artillery-grade weapon that no fighter craft to date had ever carried. This impressive cannon, in addition to an ion cannon, torpedoes, and variable ammo launchers, allowed the B-Wing Mark II to single-handedly engage targets at least as large as corvettes. And while not nearly as maneuverable as most fighters, the B-Wing Mark II was armed with more traditional fighter weaponry. Each S-foil supported 2 computer-assisted swivel-tip blasters and a medium laser cannon. Additionally, the ship was well defended, with a rear-facing blaster turret boasting an abnormally wide cone of fire. Both of these simultaneous loadouts would allow the B-Wing Mark II to contend with virtually any threat in the newly emerging post-Imperial galaxy, which mostly consisted of small groups of scrappy fighters and undercrewed small warships operated by pirates and local warlords. But ultimately, most of the duties of the B-Wing Mark II would be extended duration missions in border territories. Part of the appeal of this sort of vessel is that it can operate indefinitely, or at least as long as supplies last, and it requires no specific home base or mothership. Furthermore, the B-Wing Mark II was made even more versatile by way of the distinctive cutout on its main wing. This cutout was, in fact, a modular equipment bay that could interface directly with a variety of the B-Wing systems. Essentially, standardized modules could be fitted into this space and could contain specialized ordnance, mission-specific sensor suites, and even certain kinds of cargo. Between this and the fact that it was operated by a crew of at least 3, constantly rotating in shifts, the B-Wing Mark II could take on virtually any mission profile or mission duration, and the New Republic could maintain an ever-present watch in the fringes of their territory without ever having to man or maintain large crew-intensive ships. The B-Wing Mark II supported its crew with a surprisingly expansive interior, including a small cabin located in the main hull beside the cockpit. These interior spaces could be accessed via the airlock hub situated between the cockpit and the rear turret. This hub featured a corridor on the starboard side leading into the ship. This corridor gave access to a boarding ramp before opening into the main cabin. The cabin was by no means spacious, but with an efficient layout, it managed to provide the crew with every basic amenity. Equipped with a network-enabled computer terminal, storage compartments, a well-stocked galley, and a bed, this cabin would provide the perfect place for off-duty crew to relax and regenerate on long patrol missions. Extendable furniture would allow for multiple crew members to use the space simultaneously, though this would be rare as a crew of 3 would only ever really have 1 off-duty crew member at any given time, though these ships were known to operate with as many as 4 crew members, or with a droid, which while not consuming resources, could still take up precious space in the tiny cabin. And occasionally, while landed on inhospitable worlds or at facilities lacking accommodations, the cabin would have to support the entire crew, all using the space simultaneously for different functions. Needless to say, it could get a little hectic, and crew members absolutely required a strong bond to function properly. This particular B-Wing Mark II was known as the Trident Protector, and it was operated by a 3-man crew. The captain and lead pilot, Argo Odiko, was a native of Sereno, and although he rarely talked about his homeworld, his helmet did boast some mysterious Serenian iconography. While most topics didn't interest him, he could easily talk at length about the strengths, weaknesses, and technical specifications of virtually every conceivable starship class. Jethro Stormsailor acted as navigator and bombardier. Born and raised on freighters in the Outer Rim, he felt right at home within the tight confines of the Trident Protector. Given his lifelong adaptations to putting up with the same people for months on end, he had a permissive attitude and could make friends with almost anybody, though he was also known to tell the occasional tall tale. The Protector's 3rd crew member was known only as ISO, who served as the ship's flight engineer and doubled as the gunner in combat. For the most part, he spoke only when absolutely necessary, and spent large portions of his off time directly plugged into the ship's computer systems via his cybernetic implant. Consequently, virtually nobody knew anything about his history, but he was a valued member of the crew, as his direct link to the ship's targeting systems made him an impeccable shot while manning the turret. But despite the fact that ships like the Trident Protector and her heroic crew were very good at their assigned missions, the capricious policymakers of the New Republic would ultimately spell the downfall of the B-Wing Mark II program. While the effectiveness of the Mark II was superbly well established, the optics of these powerful gunships somewhat casually exploding entire bands of pirates evoked distasteful comparisons to the Empire's enforcement tactics. This meant that in the end, only a very small number of these craft were ever produced. After a relatively brief period of active service, most of these ships were stripped of their weapons and sold to private individuals, some finding their way into the hands of independent governments in the Outer Rim, where they would be re-equipped and would essentially take on their original role, just under the control of local defense forces. There's no record of resistance forces ever possessing a functional B-Wing Mark II, but after the cancellation of the Mark II project, Slane and Corporal's manufacturing facilities were just filled with surplus parts from unproduced ships. Engine housings, cockpit shells, hull panels, these would be sold wholesale at auction, and through this channel would find their way into Resistance hands, where they would be incorporated into the largely ad hoc ship designs of their ragtag fleet. The true potential of the B-Wing Mark II was never fully realized, but its legacy would live on in corners of the galaxy largely ignored by the major powers. By the final year of the Clone Wars, both the Z-95 and the ARC-170 starfighter had entered frontline combat with dramatic results. These robust fighters, designed by hand by the Incom Corporation and mass-produced in sub-pro factories, easily outmatched the comparatively flimsy and underpowered droid fighters of the Separatist Navy. Consequently, fighter battles were quickly becoming a one-sided affair in favor of the Republic. Looking to turn the tide back to their favor, the Separatist Council sought Valahari Shipworks, a company friendly to the Separatist cause and with a strong reputation for high-performance experimental fighters. With an exorbitant commissioning fee secured, the masterminds at Valahari Shipworks quickly set to work designing what they would eventually call the RF-1 Dart. The Dart was an ambitious design that promised to improve virtually every facet of existing Incom fighters, but after several unexpected delays, the prototype was barely flight-worthy by the end of the war. Shortly after the war, newly declared Imperial forces occupied Valahari. Despite a fierce battle and an attempt by the Valahari to destroy their own prototype hangars, Imperial forces discovered the Dart in pristine condition. Understanding immediately that this prototype fighter was an attempt to emulate Incom design, Imperial engineers shipped the Dart to the Incom Special Development Complex, an isolated skyhook facility in the Ulten system. The Incom Corporation suddenly found itself under immense pressure. The Empire was not hesitant to openly discuss with Incom representatives that the mere existence of the Dart signaled that there were deficiencies in Incom fighters. The Incom Corporation needed to achieve nothing less than perfection with their next generation fighter. Up to that point, Incom had been the obvious first choice for the Empire. Even a manufacturing powerhouse like Kuat, which had earned a strong reputation producing interceptors for the Republic, was largely winding down its fighter production to focus more heavily on the development of new capital ships. And although Sienar Fleet Systems had obtained the rights to many of Kuat's fighter patents, Sienar was primarily seen as a manufacturer of high-end transports and specialty craft. But if the Incom Corporation was even a mild problem for the Empire, Imperial technocrats would have no problem spontaneously terminating their ties with Incom in favor of another company. Naturally, the engineers at Incom set themselves immediately to reverse engineering the secrets of the RF-1 Dart. The very first thing they noticed was its striking S-foils. While the Dart clearly took inspiration from the radiators of the ARC-170, the Dart abandoned fixed wings entirely, giving it a remarkably stark and beautifully aggressive X formation. Consequently, the Dart would quickly take on the nickname X-Wing. Incom Chief Executive Condor Vantis took personal interest in the craft, relocating from corporate headquarters so he could personally oversee the reverse engineering process. Vantis was truly impressed with the Valahari adaptations on the traditional Incom approach, and he became obsessed with the idea of directly basing the next generation Incom fighter on the X-Wing prototype. But what was so impressive about this fighter? The X-Wing essentially doubled the base firepower of the ARC-170 by affixing 4 powerful laser cannons to 4 variable geometry X-formation radiator wings. The wing's surface area was significantly greater than the ARC-170 and allowed the fighter to shed a higher heat load during combat. Consequently, the X-Wing not only boasted improved engine performance, but could also achieve a far greater rate of fire. The X-Wing's elongated nose contained an advanced sensor suite, which allowed the X-Wing to acquire targets from well outside the engagement range of the ARC-170, giving it a devastating edge with its proton torpedoes. Altogether, the X-Wing was easily regarded as doubly superior to the ARC 170 and shockingly even more nimble than the Z-95. Everyone at Incom was relieved that the Separatists never managed to get this design to combat. Basically, no Republic fighter, Incom or otherwise, could have contended with it. However, the advantages of this fighter proved extremely difficult to realize in practical tests. According to the technical readouts, the X-Wing outperformed Incom fighters in basically every way, but in actual flight, its performance was only decent, roughly on par with the Z-95, but with a significantly higher burden of upkeep. So it soon became apparent why the Valahari had struggled so much to manufacture a production model of the Dart. It looked good in theory, but no living pilot could ever successfully harness its abilities into a true functional advantage. Essentially, an entire year of troubleshooting at Incom had evaporated. By this point, Incom was already falling behind the expectations of the looming empire. After Incom had thrown all of their talent at the now stagnant X-Wing development, other companies were apparently surpassing their prestige. Kuat, despite focusing almost exclusively on new Star Destroyers, had managed to produce a competent and fairly popular successor to the Nimbus Interceptor, and rumors suggested that Sienar was already developing their own new radical design. Meanwhile, Incom had nothing. Imperial delegations routinely monitored the X-Wing development project, and it was soon clear to them that Incom was making no visible progress. Incom Operations Officer Ida Citrona fervently negotiated with the Empire for more time and leniency, but the Empire's message was clear. Incom was required to deliver a production-ready prototype by the time the next Imperial delegation arrived. Looking for solutions, Citrona and Executive Vantis pored over production logs from Valahari, looking for any clues as to how the original engineers might have intended to make the X-Wing work. All they could find was a brief note cryptically referencing a partnership with Soros Sub. After a full appropriation of schematic data tapes from Soros Sub, they discovered that Valahari and Soros Sub had been joint developing a pilot-to-machine mind bridge interface for controlling starships in precisely the same way that one might control a cybernetic appendage. Through mental impulse alone. It was thought that by removing the barriers of physical controls, it might be possible for an organic pilot to unlock the hidden potential of the X-Wing. But the mind bridge had a glaring flaw. It invariably destroyed the brain of anyone who tried to link with it. After dozens of test subjects had been reduced to vegetables, the Valahari scrapped the project, but Executive Vantis ordered a recreation of the device anyway. He was confident that his hand-selected engineers could succeed where Soros Sub and Valahari could not. He was wrong. In fact, reconstructing the interface turned out to be an enormously costly endeavor, which faced all the same problems. The deadline was rapidly approaching, and Executive Vantis had a useless prototype, a potentially lethal pilot interface, and nothing remotely resembling a production-ready starfighter. A morbid mood pervaded the special development facility. The engineers were losing hope. Operations Officer Citrona had apparently disappeared. The X-Wing project had nearly ruined Incom. No, it wouldn't end this way. Executive Vantis could not allow his life's work to fade into oblivion. Incom was the future. The X-Wing was the future, and at any cost, he would realize that future. Executive Vantis himself donned the pilot interface. Nobody before had ever truly survived the process, but unlike the unfortunate test subjects of the Valahari, Executive Vantis would be using the device by his own volition. He understood the price of failure, and he had the will to succeed. Upon activating the machine, Vantis found himself in indescribable anguish, but finally, through the force of sheer will, he succeeded. His mind had linked with the machine. And so the time had come for a true test flight to prove the capabilities of the X-Wing once and for all. Directly tapping into the X-Wing systems, Vantis effortlessly outperformed every single record that the Incom Corporation had ever set. The X-Wing was viable. But the mind bridge had consequences. Executive Vantis was irreversibly fused with the avionics of the X-Wing. His mind had essentially become indistinguishable from the programming of the flight computer. He would never again be the same person. But with this grim realization came an epiphany. The Incom engineers could now program a new computer, incorporating the raw flight data from Executive Vantis. Essentially, the conscious decisions that Vantis made while linked with the X-Wing could provide the necessary assistance for a pilot to unlock the X-Wing's potential. And with an onboard astromech droid to help the pilot multitask, the mind bridge wouldn't be necessary for the production X-Wing at all. Just then, Operations Officer Citrona burst into the facility with urgent news. The Empire was approaching the system. Although it seemed like Citrona had disappeared, she was in fact secretly gathering intelligence in the core worlds. According to her findings, the Empire had unilaterally rescinded its contract with Incom and awarded the development license to Sienar. And now Incom, along with all its staff, was seen as a threat. To avoid all this talent and their designs from falling into the wrong hands, the Empire would destroy any trace of the Incom Corporation. With only moments to evacuate, the engineering staff gathered every data tape they could find and rocketed away from the facility. They escaped not a moment too soon. The facility erupted into flames behind them, and the escapees found themselves pursued by the Empire's bizarre new fighters. Condor Vantis was still in the air for test flights, and with the last notions of his fleeting humanity, he wordlessly directed his X-Wing into the fray. He was impossibly outnumbered, but the X-Wing was a terrifying opponent for these Imperial pilots. No one knew who might win such a battle, but it was just enough to allow the Incom staff to escape. Condor Vantis and the X-Wing prototype would seemingly disappear altogether after that battle. Ida Citrona and the Incom engineering staff would themselves disappear from public life and resume Incom operations from a secret location in the Nada sector. Incom fired up production again, with its products manufactured in ghost factories outside the immediate reach of the Empire. After the company was partially re-established, the Incom engineers returned attention to the X-Wing project. They had lost the prototype, but using salvaged data and the test flight telemetry from Vantis, the production version of the X-Wing was born. A ship that was more than a match for any Imperial fighter, largely thanks to its unrivaled flight computer programming, giving what would normally be a large and unwieldy fighter the ability to go toe-to-toe with even interceptor-type ships. The X-Wing, with its tight handling and heavy firepower, perfectly rode the line between an interceptor and a torpedo bomber, and could excel at either role given the right pilot behind the controls. Ida Citrona, who was well connected with subversive Imperial senators and officials, detected a keen black market demand for a robust and accessible combat starfighter to equip newly forming anti-Imperial groups who were short on professional training and manpower. Essentially, since every individual X-Wing flight computer was augmented with the mental impulses from Executive Vantis, even a pilot lacking professional training could take the X-Wing into combat effectively, making it a perfect fit for these groups who could now focus more directly on combat and less on rigorously training pilots. If Incom could supply X-Wing fighters to these groups, it would secure a long-term source of funding from organizations willing to spend whatever it took to secure a next-generation fighter to combat the Empire on equal terms. Incom would quietly designate this new fighter the T-65, which alongside the T-16 and the T-47 would inaccurately categorize the X-Wing as a sports airspeeder and not a combat starfighter. According to plan, this decision would ultimately allow Rebel cells to snatch up X-Wings without initially drawing too much attention from any Imperial authority who might be reading the receipts. By the time the Empire noticed what was happening, militia cells across the galaxy had been armed with state-of-the-art starfighters. So in a twist of fate, the X-Wing project, originally commissioned by the Empire, would become the Empire's worst nightmare. But it wasn't just these new X-Wings which were now causing havoc across the Empire. Stories arose sporadically of a lone X-form starfighter of an unusual design that would appear from the void, utterly destroy Imperial targets, and disappear as easily as it had appeared. Nobody recognized the exact make of this fighter, and the identity of the pilot was completely unknown. Soon rumors began to spread, and legends began to form about this mysterious vigilante. Some said that the Grey Escapist, which became the name of both the pilot and the fighter craft as far as anyone was concerned, was a bounty hunter using Imperial targets as a cheap means to sharpen his skills. But as the escapist was never observed to land at any port, nor was seen to engage in any bounty hunting or mercenary work, the rumors gradually took on a more supernatural tone. Spacers began to say that the escapist was the vengeful spirit of a man who lost everything to the Empire and now roams from one end of the galaxy to the other, waging an endless war on the ones who stole his life from him. The Grey Escapist would be little more than a legend until the Battle of Endor, where it would appear unbidden to fight alongside the rebellion. The pilot would neither communicate with nor take orders from anyone, but would zip effortlessly across the engagement zone, shooting down a dizzying number of Imperial fighters. After the destruction of the second Death Star, the Escapist would disappear once more, perhaps never to be seen again. I'm calling this ship a Corellian tractor transport. I imagine that this rugged industrial vessel was designed with total modularity in mind, making it the perfect ship for a wide variety of different purposes, and making it attractive to organizations like the Alliance to Restore the Republic, which required multi-role starships that could be easily outfitted to military specifications. The most popular configuration consisted of a tractor unit and a single forward module. This could be a multi-role module suitable for carrying a respectable load of both passengers and cargo, or it could be a module completely dedicated to either passengers or cargo, or really anything you can think of. I imagine that the Corellian Engineering Corporation offered an impressive array of customizable options for these modules, and third-party companies would increase the lineup even further. Even starships with no affiliation to the Corellian Engineering Corporation at all, like Coensair medium haulers, were purposely designed to be compatible with this modular system, and while pushing only one module gave the tractor transport a very strong ratio of thrust performance to utility, the powerful engines of the tractor unit were capable of pushing much more, meaning that a variety of intermediate modules were also available, affording the ship even more customization options, though spacers mostly took advantage of this with freight modules that allowed the tractor transport to push a surprising amount of cargo. The tractor transport was controlled from a dorsal cockpit module, which gave the pilot a commanding view of the ship's cargo and also functioned as a vantage point for directing planet-side operations like the unloading and loading of cargo. The story that I've come up with for this particular Corellian tractor transport is that it was officially registered as the R77077, but was known to friends and allies as the Cyclops 7. While the Cyclops 7 looked externally like a fairly standard tractor transport, the ship actually served as the mobile base for a small rebel operation that originated on the planet Tantara. The leader of this group was Captain Shua, who was distantly related to the King of Tantara, at least distantly enough to avoid the direct scrutiny of the Galactic Empire. Shua's family, no strangers to the moderate wealth that came with distant relation to the throne, operated several simultaneous businesses, one of them being a respectable though somewhat small-scale freight company. Shua commanded one of the dozen or so tractor transports that formed the backbone of the company, and found himself increasingly frustrated with the regulations, stiff penalties, and consequential paranoia that came with doing business with the expanding empire. Captain Shua traveled widely enough to recognize that the empire had a tendency of absorbing or forcibly conquering any supposedly sovereign powers that they pleased. And with this growing pressure on Tararan space, it was clear to Captain Shua that if the empire was not opposed, the Tararan way of life would disappear forever. To save his planet, Shua would secretly modify his ship, the Cyclops 7, into something capable of fighting the empire. Consequently, much of the living space aboard the Cyclops 7 tractor unit was converted into a robust command center. Here, the crew could fire remotely controlled weapons, operate hidden reconnaissance equipment, and engage in long-range communications with a sizable network of fellow freight crews across the galaxy who had also taken up subversive activities against the Empire. Long before they would formally join the Alliance, Captain Shua and his crew of the Cyclops 7 maintained appearances as one of their company's many faceless cargo vessels. This proved to be an effective front to inconspicuously operate within Imperial space. Landing on planets largely ignored, they could essentially park a capable fighting force directly on the doorstep of Imperial facilities and infrastructure. While conducting legal business on one hand, they could strike Imperial facilities with the other and then disappear immediately afterward. Amid the hustle of daily ship traffic, a single tractor transport rarely drew attention to itself, and through clever scheduling and carefully crafted plausible deniability, the crew of the Cyclops 7 almost never drew suspicion. Even the executives of their own company barely noticed the anomalous behavior, giving Captain Shua and his crew a remarkable level of cover. After several years of successful raids, these brave fighters were eventually contacted by Alliance Command through their secret freight network. From here, a formal relationship with the Alliance was born. The crew would continue to operate under their ostensibly legal cargo activities, but would also begin to smuggle less than legal Alliance cargo. Furthermore, they would use their connections and convincing front to transport covert Alliance personnel deep into Imperial space. Now that the Cyclops was routinely transporting important passengers and the occasional fully outfitted strike team, they added passenger accommodations to their previously cargo-focused forward module, while still preserving a large open space and lower cargo deck. Ultimately, the ship was still spacious enough to house fairly heavy equipment and even some small combat vehicles like speeder bikes and cannon sleds. The true operations of the Cyclops were unknown even to most in the Alliance, who simply considered it one of dozens of small cargo vessels that offered material support. This double-blind anonymity, as well as some institutional protection from their family connections on Tantara, ensured that the Cyclops 7 stayed several steps ahead of the Empire through the entirety of the war, and afforded it a level of access to Imperial space that was impossible for most Alliance vessels. When spotted at Rendezvous Point Gamma 9, the Cyclops had just returned from a reconnaissance mission on the planet Imdar, and only stayed with the fleet for a short period before departing with Alliance agents for another classified mission. I've been calling this ship the JB-75 Star Clipper, produced by Gallofree yards long before even the Clone Wars. I imagine these Star Clippers were fairly adaptable, making them suitable for multiple roles. At 20 meters long, the ship was readily manageable by a crew of 2 and affordable even for independent entrepreneurs. It was well suited for passengers and spacious enough to carry light freight. Local planetary defense forces were also known to use these Star Clippers, but the stock version of the ship was a bit infamous for its flimsy hull paneling, which made it largely unsuitable for combat without extensive defensive modifications. This particular JB-75 was known as the Setback Dream, piloted by a down-on-their-luck duo who came to the Tattoo system to stake an allegedly valuable mining claim on the third moon of Tatooine. A sudden meteor strike destroyed their stabilization systems, sending the ship spinning out of control and into the surface of Tatooine. Nobody knows what became of these unfortunate spacers, but seemingly everyone who saw the wreck came to the conclusion that this starship must not be disturbed and must remain as a memorial for future generations. While this reverence might sound odd, many actually saw a bit of themselves in the implicit story behind the wreck. That is, nobody comes to Tatooine because his life is going well. And the implied tragedy behind every shipwreck is in some way the story of nearly all who find themselves on Tatooine, making crash sites like this almost sacred to the settlers on that distant world. One such caravel, called the Pelea, was owned by Vence Zarmond, a high-ranking Imperial technocrat from the planet Loranar. Zarmond suffered some humiliation when he was conned out of his starship by the notorious Kar and Cram Hobib. These rambunctious brothers owned a veritable fleet of ill-gotten vessels that they leased for modest rates, though they accepted no liability for what might happen if law enforcement or angry past owners happened to find the ships out and about in the galaxy. Many of their customers were themselves involved in less than legal activities, such as affiliation with the Alliance to Restore the Republic, an organization that Kar and Cram gradually grew to respect and would eventually join after the destruction of the first Death Star. At first, they merely donated some of their stolen vessels, but would eventually enter the fight themselves, with the caravel they had obtained and subsequently heavily modified into a competent vessel which they now called Wingless Victory. The Wingless Victory would typically engage in courier and transportation missions rather than outright combat, but when all combat-capable vessels were called to fight at Endor, the Hobib brothers, intent on not missing the climactic battle, installed a few additional weapons on their vessel, including a turbolaser that far exceeded the ship's typical safety rating. After the battle, the Wingless Victory would be called to serve as a landing craft, ferrying Alliance troops to the Forest Moon to occupy the Imperial facilities there. I would place this ship some 10 or 15 years before the Clone Wars, and I imagine Gallofree yards would attempt to make the smallest possible long-range passenger liner, marketing the GR-75 as the perfect starship to fit in between smaller, low-cost transports that offered little beyond a single seat to passengers, and huge passenger liners like those of the Mon Calamari, whose starships were loaded with lavish and difficult-to-maintain facilities. This meant that the GR-75 could remain compact enough to operate out of almost any spaceport, but just barely large enough to offer proper accommodations to a respectable number of passengers. Individual operators could outfit their starliners with different sorts of interior layouts, but here we see a GR-75 operated by Londayar Starlines, which aimed to offer long-range services to passengers who were essentially moving their entire lives to new planets. As such, these passengers might have lots of cargo and could book a cargo container along with their fare. These starliners would make long circuits around Republic space, picking up and dropping off passengers as they went. Depending on where you got on and where you were going, passengers could expect to spend a relatively long time on the ship, so accommodations, though tight, were much less limited than they often were on smaller transports. While private first-class cabins with viewports were available, the majority of passengers would find their personal accommodations centered around a number of passenger hub modules. These dormitory-style accommodations would offer little in privacy, but every passenger would have access to a bunk and personal storage, as well as a variety of communal facilities. Unfortunately, Gallofree's gamble of creating a budget starliner meant that the GR-75 was never particularly well suited for its intended role. It was far too expensive to operate as a low-cost passenger transport, and it was simply not large enough to operate as a proper starliner. As such, only a small number of companies managed to operate successful passenger routes using the GR-75, with the majority of these ships actually remaining unsold in Gallofree sales lots across the galaxy. Desperate to make any sort of return, Gallofree would start selling the GR-75 stripped of most of its amenities at an enormous discount. While this ultimately wouldn't actually help the company much, the resulting subculture of spacers heavily modifying these ships to fill all sorts of different roles would last well beyond the end of Gallofree as a company shortly into the Imperial era. It was soon discovered that with the right modifications, the GR-75 made an excellent cargo ship, but unfortunately could never publicly operate as such with the Empire's zealous licensing requirements and restrictions on commerce. Consequently, these illegally modified starships would find their way into the hands of individuals and groups who already operated outside or against the Empire. The ever-growing alliance to restore the Republic would further maximize the carrying capacity of the GR-75 by removing the spacious bridge complex and replacing it with a cramped one-man cockpit. Propelled by newly souped-up engines, these improvised barges were faster than almost any cargo vessel of similar size on the market, so the GR-75 would prove to be one of the most valuable ships in the Alliance fleet. The Alliance would also use a limited number of these vessels as blockade runners. The ship's original hull design had already excelled at deflecting glancing blows, so equipping additional armor and shielding could grant the GR-75 surprising survivability in very short entanglements. But even when the GR-75 was serving in combat roles, it was largely employed as an action rescue ship. Alliance engagements often required jumping into Imperial-controlled space, hitting a target, and jumping out, meaning that the only time to retrieve escape vehicles was during the fighting itself. This critical role often fell on the GR-75, which, under protection from dedicated starfighter wings, would weave around the combat zone, evacuating crippled ships and making use of its exposed ventral bay to rapidly retrieve escape pods and starfighter ejection modules. Altogether, the GR-75 would be an indispensable asset to the Alliance, filling multiple roles in the fleet. Though the work of the GR-75 was often thankless, it would prove critical in the fight to restore the Republic and to return the galaxy to a state where, with some luck, the GR-75 and ships like it could once again return to more elegant peacetime duties. As the Empire took control, the edict was given that every symbol of the Republic had to be retired or redesigned for the new era. This particularly included prominent Republic military vehicles, such as the so-called Republic gunship, which, despite the massive cost in scrapping them and commissioning new vehicles, it was considered an acceptable loss in the greater goal of projecting the image of an all-powerful empire that inherited nothing from the old corrupt order. Like the rest of the Empire's frontline ground attack vehicles, the Imperial successor to the Republic gunship would be developed directly by Kuat Drive Yards, which somewhat controversially restyled the vehicle to have a design and many components in common with its AT line walkers. Thus, the LAAG was born, the Low Altitude Assault Gunship. Kuat Drive Yards operated under the assumption of utter Imperial air supremacy in all possible use cases, so these new gunships no longer needed to be as nimble as the Republic predecessors, and were thus designed with robust armor that was uncharacteristically heavy for an aerial vehicle. Kuat argued that these gunships would be penetrating and subduing deeply entrenched insurgent forces, not engaging structured military forces with proper air support, so air defense systems were largely ignored in favor of heavier underside armor and heavier ground-targeting weaponry derived from Kuat's AT line walkers. That being said, the LAAG wasn't particularly helpless in aerial combat and could launch air-to-air weapons from launcher modules developed in close cooperation with Scianar. This collaboration simplified supply logistics by ensuring that all Imperial flying vehicles, regardless of manufacturer, were compatible with the same weaponry, and the self-contained nature of these modules meant that even conscripted local ground crews unfamiliar with Imperial ordnance could effectively arm Imperial vehicles. Additional aerial defenses on the gunship included a turreted rear laser cannon to fend off pursuit. Despite this feature, this gunship was considered somewhat easily overpowered from behind and from above, but that was only in the fleetingly unlikely chance that enemies of the Empire would have sufficient command of the airspace to do so. The LAAG was also equipped with 2 wingtip composite beam laser dishes. While highly destructive and a potent force of psychological warfare, these weapons were not without their problems. The composite beam dishes of the Republic gunship had been mounted in sealed spherical housings, but to maximize the power output in the same amount of space, the Imperial version would significantly scale up the emitter dishes at the cost of the protective housing. This exposed the relatively delicate components to undue wear. Coupled with finicky mechanical articulation, the composite beam lasers were prone to failure and were consequently used somewhat sparingly. Kuat drive yards would also develop specialized variants of the LA line, including the low-altitude combat hauler, which could carry supplies and light combat vehicles directly into a war zone. Much smaller than the armor carriers of the Clone Wars, these new combat haulers couldn't handle anything much larger than a scout walker, but could still carry about 6 troops and supplies in addition to combat vehicles, allowing the LACH to theoretically deploy a fully supplied squad of troops with armor support all in a single landing. The original low-altitude assault transport had been an indispensable staple of the Republic's combat strategy during the Clone Wars, and Kuat had hoped to sell a high volume of these new gunships to the Empire, but the Empire consistently maintained that strategies involving the tactical insertion and extraction of troops were only employed from a position of weakness, and were ultimately unfitting for displays of Imperial power. The idea was to stop rebellion from starting in the first place through raw intimidation, not to engage with them in protracted combat on their own terms. This combat philosophy meant that relatively few of these new gunships would see service, and even fewer would see frontline combat, as most were deployed in second or even third waves, or entirely after the engagement to mop up and perform search and rescue operations. Because of this, the LAAG was often manned by the standard infantry corps of the Imperial Army, rarely having the honor of serving the Empire's elite stormtroopers. As the infantry were generally associated with low-risk peacekeeping on far-flung worlds, the LAAG eventually earned a reputation as the sort of vehicle that was used only to carry cargo and unfortunate personnel around desolate outposts at the fringes of the galaxy. This, of course, ignored the gunship's incredible potential and the fact that many of these gunships would actually be found in the opposite context, in densely urbanized core worlds, where it was considered infeasible to deploy vehicles like walkers, which were the Empire's more favored weapons of intimidation. But when it came to air and space supremacy, the Empire focused heavily on the production of enormous capital ships and in producing overwhelming numbers of disposable fighters. They ultimately neglected the middle ground of tactically robust vehicles designed for flexibility and survivability. This left little room in the Imperial arsenal for a genuine successor to the Republic gunship, which was a type of vehicle that would largely remain a product of the past. This is the Scianar GAT-18 Imperial Blast Boat, the successor to the venerated GAT-12 Skip Ray Blast Boat. This new version would be exclusively produced for the Galactic Empire and designed to the same engineering standards of Scianar's other Imperial vessels, like the TIE Fighter and the Lambda Shuttle. The motivation to produce this vessel came when the designers at Scianar Fleet Systems identified a relative lack of focus on intermediate-sized ships in the Imperial Starfleet, which relied heavily on swarm fighters and on capital ships with very little in between. While reviewing past ships produced by the company, Scianar designers considered the Skipray blast boat. Despite being popular during the height of the Clone Wars, the ship was really only a popular choice for mercenaries and planetary militias, and saw fairly limited military deployment during the war. The Skipray was known for its ability to engage a wide variety of targets, but the Navy of the Galactic Republic had a fairly nuanced approach to fleet building with a healthy spread of ships of various sizes and roles, and there simply wasn't a strong demand for such an expensive and independent ship. But the combat profile of the Skipray would be perfect to fill the identified gaps in the Imperial Starfleet, so Scianar engineers got to work updating this design for the Galactic Empire. The Imperial blast boat would draw heavily from what made the original Skipray blast boat so unique. It would be equipped with the largest possible reactor, taking up a relatively enormous share of the ship's internal volume, but allowing the vessel to be equipped with disproportionately powerful shields and weapons. The Imperial blast boat essentially needed to match anything from fighters to frigates, so it couldn't be an ordinary gunship. It almost needed to rival a proper corvette in terms of firepower and survivability. Consequently, the Imperial blast boat would be equipped not only with laser cannons, blasters, and ordnance launchers for concussion missiles and torpedoes, but would also have ion cannons and even a proper turbo laser. This XV-7 turbo laser was technically the smallest weapon that the Empire still classified as a turbo laser, but it was still the sort of heavy weapon that would normally never be found on a ship as small as the Imperial blast boat. This capital-grade weapon, in cooperation with its powerful ion cannons, gave this vessel the ability to engage targets much larger than itself, or make very short work of vessels of similar size. But despite these powerful weapons, most of the blast boat's weaponry was heavily forward-focused, which made the vessels somewhat vulnerable to multi-directional attacks. This could be easily solved by deploying the blast boat in pairs, as was recommended, but they more frequently operated alone. And while the Imperial blast boat was well armed and well shielded, what had granted it exceptional abilities in the first place, its oversized reactor, could be something of a liability in prolonged combat. The power requirements were enormous, and the reactor was finicky and required continuous maintenance, and in the rare chance that the ship was legitimately outclassed in combat, the blast boat was considered very temperamental if it sustained basically any damage to its power systems. Consequently, it was important that the Imperial blast boat was equipped with a spacious and well-armored escape pod system designed directly into the cockpit to allow the crew a rapid escape in the few precious moments between critical failure and total destruction. On balance, the Imperial blast boat was considered a highly capable vessel that fairly effectively filled the gap in the Starfleet that it was intended to fill. But by the time that the blast boat was introduced, Imperial commanders had already been trained on and acclimated to the use of large capital ships and swarms of small fighters, and they were hesitant to adopt a ship like the Imperial blast boat with its unfamiliar loadout and combat profile. Consequently, these ships would find very little use in the Imperial Navy, but Imperial customs enforcement was another matter. In this particular avenue, the Empire was struggling to police the thousands of hyperlanes and backwater systems frequented by the galaxy's smugglers and pirates. Short-range fighters certainly couldn't accomplish this, and enormous capital ships were better used elsewhere. Consequently, the Imperial Office of Customs was largely reliant on older or less than ideal ships for the job. The Imperial blast boat perfectly solved the problems that Imperial Customs was facing. The ship was combat capable enough to engage virtually anything that customs enforcement could be expected to face, from illegally armed light freighters all the way to pirate corvettes. Its only limitation in this role was that its low crew complement would be frequently outnumbered during boarding action. Taking prisoners and securing contraband would be a routine part of the job, and the blast boat's crew of 4 simply wasn't up to the task. That's why the Imperial blast boat carried a detachment of specialized combat drones, which, while not particularly powerful or well armored, were generally more than enough deterrent against the sorts of unprofessional resistance they were expected to encounter. Altogether, the Imperial blast boat was a formidable ship and effectively fulfilled a thankless role in situations where larger ships lacked the versatility and smaller ships lacked the necessary endurance and firepower. But as the Imperial blast boat generally operated far from the front lines, it never really earned a reputation worthy of its abilities. Nevertheless, it was a feared sight for those it was hunting, and it was often the last thing a smuggler ever saw.